Chinese President Xi Jinping will head to Cambodia later today after wrapping up a trip to Malaysia. That's part of his three-nation swing through Southeast Asian countries, which includes Vietnam. The Chinese leader is trying to cobble deals with ASEAN amidst a trade standoff with Washington. China and Malaysia agreed to deepen cooperation in various fields and inked 31 agreements ranging from trade, tourism, transport, and agriculture. President Xi touted his country's partnership with Malaysia in his speech from the capital, Kuala Lumpur, while calling for other Asian nations to resist protectionism.
In the face of shocks to global order and economic globalization, China and Malaysia will stand with countries in the region to combat the undercurrents of geopolitical and camp-based confrontation, overcome the countercurrents of unilateralism and protectionism, and safeguard the promising prospects for development in our shared Asian home.
Chris Humphrey is the Executive Director of EU-ASEAN Business Council, joining us live this morning out of the SGX. And Chris, thank you very much for joining us. Before we get to the EU-ASEAN cooperation angle, let's talk about what's happening in the EU and the conversation happening in that particular bloc. Because, I mean, looking at the currency, for example, people must be thinking that the European region might be the safe haven in this trade war between mostly the U.S. and China. What's your takeaway so far?
Morning, Jerry. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I think the EU can be seen as a bit of a safe haven. It's another large economy like China. It can stand up, I think, to the US, like the Chinese are standing up to the US. But largely, it's out of the initial firing line. I know President Trump has said Europe has been screwing, excuse my words, the US for many, many years. But I don't think that's not his prime target. Clearly, his prime target is China and Chinese companies around the world sending stuff into the US. So, yeah, I think for many respects, for some companies, Europe will be seen as that safe haven. Euro seems to be holding up pretty well at the moment. We're waiting to see what the ECB does later today. But I don't think there's going to be major changes. Europe is standing strong. They have a plan in place, and they'll wait to see how the US is reacting.
At least when it comes to the country-specific reciprocal tariffs, announced at the Rose Garden event, Europe definitely felt like it was out of the initial firing line, as you described, Chris. But what was really the messaging coming out of the Munich Security Conference? I mean, J.D. Vance did a whole shakedown of European allies. Was there a big takeaway for the EU, and perhaps could that bolster its trading relationship with the rest of the world, ex the U.S.?
Well, I'll be quite honest with you. I was in Brussels 2 or 3 weeks ago. The mood in Brussels now is very, very different. I think they've suddenly realized the US is not our friend. It's not the great brother we could rely on going forward in terms of defense and in terms of trade and other things around the world global trading order. And that really has lifted up other regions on the agenda in Brussels. Southeast Asia in particular now is much higher up the agenda than it was before. Europe needs to look around the world and see which other partners are out there who have a similar mindset when it comes to multilateralism and the global world trading order, where the growth markets are, and where can we build relationships that suit the European ideals.
So, Chris, here's the thing, right? You're saying the EU is viewing the U.S. as not our friend anymore, right? But I can think back through history where there were several, maybe not mistakes, but certainly stumbles, right? When Europe, led by Germany, obviously, bet on cheap Russian oil to revitalize industry in Germany and the rest of Europe, and it worked for a while until it didn't, right? Until the war broke out, etc. The other bet was on China, right? Huge investment by a lot of European industrial names in China until that started kind of going south as well. So now what does Europe do?
I think Europe needs to take a more long-term view of the world. And when it comes to China, Europe's position has been very different to the US. Particularly the Trump administration is very anti-China. Europe are all taking a much more pragmatic approach with China. We need you, you need us, we need to work things out between each other. And that relationship will continue to go.
So I need to ask you, right, one of the most, the clear signs of that is, and the distinction between the EU and the U.S. is, in the U.S. we barely have any sort of Chinese EVs there, right, much less factories, et cetera. Right? In Europe, exactly the opposite, right? I mean, the fact is, Chinese EVs are eating everybody's lunch. But Europe is saying, okay, well, look, fine. They're cheap. They're actually not pretty decent quality-wise, right? So come on in, set up a factory, and sell in the EU, export if you want as well. Meantime, you create European jobs. We like that. At what stage, though, is it going to end in some pushback, especially on, let's say, national security grounds? Because, I mean, in that sense, Europe and the U.S., they share those concerns.
Well, you know, Europe actually want to impose some penal tariffs on Chinese EVs being exported from China into Europe. Interestingly, the European automotive industry was like, please don't do that. And that's largely because they have significant interest themselves in China. So there's a balance to be struck there. And the thing about Chinese EVs going into Europe, they're actually helping Europe achieve some of their own environmental objectives.
This is true, yeah.
Yeah, so they're cheap, but they are pretty good cars. Yeah. And, you know, the fact is the Chinese invested heavily in EVs way before the rest of the world did. So everyone's got to play catch up on that.
Okay. So let's get to the EU and ASEAN, which is your space, right? You know, Sherry was talking about Xi Jinping's swing through Southeast Asia. I wouldn't be surprised if next stop is going to be bigger economies like, say, Indonesia, maybe Thailand, etc. What about with the EU? Because when I think about it, for China, right, the U.S. as a destination for their products, for their exports, is actually only probably third on the list, right? At the very top is Southeast Asia and then the EU.
That is very true, and I think PM Anwar earlier in the year was expressing some concern that Southeast Asia may become a dumping ground for more Chinese goods in the face of a trade war with the US. And that was probably part of their discussions this week as well in KL. I think for Southeast Asia, this is a region which is growing, and it's growing fast and rapidly, and those fundamentals behind that growth aren't about to change. And this is why the EU is taking more interest. This is why President Xi is coming down here and meeting, you know, Cambodia and Malaysia and Vietnam. It's an important trading bloc. China is by far Southeast Asia's largest trading partner, but China has a huge surplus with ASEAN as a whole. It's the largest trading partner for most of the ASEAN member states as well. That relationship's not about to change. That's going to continue. It's the 800-pound gorilla in their neighborhood. Yeah. So they need to work with it. But equally, ASEAN wants to work with other partners. And you'd have heard statements coming out from the ASEAN finance ministers last week, from the economic ministers last week, saying, you know, we need to, first of all, ramp up our own integration, trade more with each other, but we also need to work more with other partners, and that includes the EU.
Right. Sure.
So, speaking of ramping up cooperation between ASEAN and the EU, do you think it can actually lead to some kind of region-to-region free trade agreement? I know that the EU has bilateral FTAs with Singapore and Vietnam, I believe, but could it lead to something bigger?
That's always the dream, Sherry. It's been my dream ever since I've been doing this job now for a decade. That's where we need to end up. I would say we're now in a world where the EU is taking Southeast Asia much more seriously on terms of trade policy and trade negotiations. We're at the best state they've ever been. So beyond those two FTAs you mentioned, we have ongoing negotiations with Indonesia, with Thailand, with Malaysia, and with the Philippines. And I think Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines could well be done pretty rapidly. There's now an increased sense of urgency on both sides to get those deals done. If we get 2, maybe 3 out of those 4 over the line in the next 24 months, then I think we're in a position where we can start talking again about a region-to-region FTA between the EU and ASEAN. It's certainly something we at the Council want. It's certainly something our members and European businesses want, and we've made that point many, many times to people in Brussels.
What are the biggest challenges in trying to achieve this region-to-region free trade agreement? Is it regulation? Is it politics?
It's partly the disparity, I think, in terms of economic development here in Southeast Asia. You know, you have highly developed economies like Singapore at one end and least developed economies like Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar at the other end. At the moment, there's a political issue, of course, with Myanmar that makes it very, very hard for the EU to negotiate with ASEAN as a bloc. In the past, the reasoning's been doing it as a bloc with 10 countries, that's been far too difficult. I don't think that's really an excuse any longer. We've seen ASEAN work as one when they were negotiating on RCEP. I think they could work as one negotiating with the EU. So for the moment, I think the EU is focused very much developing those bilateral FTAs. When they're done, there'll be a revisiting of the region to region.